Episode 59. Hello, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Dogman Encounters Radio. I'm Vic Cundiff, and I'll be your host as we listen to eyewitness encounters involving one of the most terrifying cryptids, dogmen. Before we bring Josh back on for tonight's show, I've got an encounter I want to read to you that I received. This encounter took place in New Brunswick, Canada. And reads, My grandfather told me this story when I was a teenager. I'm 52 now. My granddad grew up in the woods of central New Brunswick, Canada. It's a very remote area. Only survivalists go where they lived. Their whole family lived out in the sticks. They lived by hunting, fishing, trapping, and by doing some logging. Granddad said when he was a teenager, he and his older brother Duke were up in the early hours checking trap lines on an old motorbike. It was early fall and frost was on the grass. Still, early morning mists hung around the forest edges. He was rolling cigarettes with his brother. They were out of matches, so they dipped a bit of cloth in the gas tank and ignited it off a coil wire while Duke kicked the bike over. The sound of a bike being kicked over without an ignition sounds sort of like an animal call. That's how my granddad described it. Anyways, just as they started smoking their cigarettes, my grandfather noticed something bounding through the tree line toward them. Granddad said it ran the same way a bear does, but it stopped after several yards and stood up on its hind legs. It was still too far away for them to tell what it was, but they assumed it was a black bear because they're very common in New Brunswick. That's when it began walking upright toward them. As it got nearer, Granddad said it looked like a huge werewolf. His family origin was German, so this was not unknown. It got as close as 20 feet away before stopping to eye them closely. It sniffed their smokes and then turned and hopped/ran back to the trees. Granddad said they weren't scared, only shocked that such a creature was living in the woods. Granddad said it was taller than any man. He also said it was huge and had hair all over its body. It had a large head, evil eyes, and long upright ears. It had hands with long claws on its fingertips. I can't remember what color he said its fur was, but he said it had wolf-like legs. That's his story. He had many more like it, too. Thank you. Signed, Andy. Thanks so much for submitting that story, Andy. I really appreciate it. If you'll remember, we had Josh Turner on last week. We couldn't go through all of his stories because of time constraints, so we're going to take off this week where we left off last week.
This happened to a friend of mine. Her name's Jessica. She lives out near Del Valley. There's all these little towns around here. Where she lived, it was out on the edge, not in town, I want to say, but she had neighbors. Her story was that when her grandmother was dying, she had taken care of her. She was a bartender that worked for this club years ago. She told me this story after Jacob had shared his, and this was, I don't know, right around that same time. She didn't actually see one of these things, but that she believed that that's what it was. But the grandmother did. And the grandmother had bone cancer or something. She was in her last days, and there was nothing they could do to just go and tell her to go home and try to make her as comfortable as possible. So the grandmother was living with her and her husband at the time. Her husband and her split up because he was an alcoholic and there was all kinds of problems. She said that on different occasions, when they would argue, her and her husband, that they would hear something bump the house, like it was telling them to be quiet. She always attributed it to, the house, maybe there's a ghost. Something happened out here on this property. More than once, they thought that they heard something climb up on the roof of the house. And she said one time, her grandmother said that she was sitting by the window, and in the distance, she saw these coyotes jumping around playing with something like a bigger animal, and that it was laying on its back and kind of rolling around with these coyotes, and that it stood up and kind of shook itself, and it stood up on hind legs. She told Jessica, she's like, I saw this coyote-looking thing, but it was really big and tall, and it was laying on the ground, and it was playing around with these coyotes. It was literally playing with them. They were jumping around in the pasture, and it stood up on its hind legs. So she thought, oh, my grandmother's medication is getting to her. She's like, oh, okay, that's cute, Grandma. You saw something strange. Well, one night, her grandmother had passed away. It was just her out there with her son. Her son was only like 3 years old or something. She said that she went to sleep, and she heard something, boom, like jump down on top of the roof. She said it was right above her bedroom, and she said their nearest neighbors were a half mile away. You could see the lights from the trailer park, but that was it. You couldn't yell for help. Nobody's going to hear you. She said she was surrounded by just pastures and then a tree line. She said that she was terrified, and this thing started scratching on the roof and tromping around, and then she heard something like slide down the side of the house. She said the only thing she could think of was what her grandmother said she had seen that day, probably like a year before that. She said it had probably been about a year since her grandmother had passed. So I don't know how much time before that she said she had seen it, but anyway, she said that it had been a while. She was like, oh my God, and she just kept thinking that that's what it was. And then she heard something had like claws and just rubbed them along the side of the house. You could hear it going across the paneling of the house from like the one side all the way to her bedroom window. Then she heard something pushing up against the window, and she just thought, oh my God, this thing is going to bust through the glass. She said she was laying in her bed, she was petrified, and she just reached over and grabbed the phone, and she called the sheriff's department. She didn't know what else to do. The sheriff's department came out, and they went around, and they looked at the side of the house, and they saw these it was just like three really long scratches and then a smaller, more faint one running along the side of the house. It was like this, whatever it was, something had scratched it. They didn't see any footprints. Anyway, she had this guy friend of hers that lived close by. She had him come out there the next day, and he got up on the roof with another friend of his, and they found the paneling, the shingles and everything had been ripped off the top of the roof, and there was a hole there. It looked like it had dug in to where it had gotten into the insulation. It wasn't big enough for something to crawl through, but it had started digging into the top of the roof. So that was her story, and she said that she had 2 dogs out there that had gone missing, one after the other. She never saw them again. After that, she moved. Her name is Jessica, and she gave me permission to use her name. So, yeah, that was just the creepy story. But like I said, she said she never saw it. She didn't see it. She just knows that what her grandmother claimed she saw, which was kind of weird to see something like that. Up to that point, she'd attributed it to her medication because she was dying of cancer. That brings me to another story about my grandmother. When I was 17, my grandmother told me a story, because shortly after I had come out and told my story what happened to me when I was 15, my grandmother said, one of these days I'll tell you my story. She wouldn't tell me right then. I don't know why. She made me wait about it. But then one day, she told me what had happened to her, and she said it in front of me and my brother and some other people and my friends that I had, and we went over there. She told me her story. She said that one day they were in Louisiana. My grandfather and her were driving. He was a truck driver for years. They were going down the road near Alexandria in Louisiana, and they saw this. The way she described it was hunched over on 2 legs, kind of like a cross between a man, a wolf, and a hyena. That's the only way she could describe it to us. And she said it was hunched over, and it stood up on its hind legs, and it looked like it was doing something, like it was eating something off the side of the road, like roadkill. And my grandfather, being the very pragmatic and sometimes ridiculous person that he was just like, it was just some guy out there who crawled out of the swamp and was dirty. You know? And my grandmother was like, no, it wasn't. You know? She's like, this was some sort of weird thing. And she said that when they lived out in Louisiana for a while, and she said that she had heard stories of this thing, they call it the loup-garou. She swears that that had to be what I saw. It had to be the same creature. So she had this encounter, whatever, and she claimed that my grandfather, J.D., had an incident near Pinto Canyon, oddly enough, outside of Marfa. It's this canyon you have to drive through to get into Mexico to go to this little town called Candelaria where my grandfather's friends live. He claimed that he saw what he called a really scrawny coyote-looking thing crawl up out of the canyon and run across the road and go up onto the hill. And that pass where you had to go through, it was called Pinto Canyon, literally. And you had to go through this winding road, and I remember going down it when I was a little kid, and it was just creepy, man. It was so dark, and it was just winding around. And in that area out there, the McDonald Observatory is out there in that area. near Fort Davis. It's just in between Marfa and Fort Davis, whatever. And the reason they built the observatory out there is because it's one of the darkest places. So they chose that spot because you could look up and see all the stars out there in that area. It's very beautiful. I'm not a big deserty person, but I can find beauty in just about any landscape, and there was a lot of beauty out there. I wouldn't want to live out there. It's too desolate. But, to the south is the Big Bend National Park, and that's a lot of wild land out there. And then, of course, we're up in the canyon. We're going to Candelaria. At the bottom of the canyon, you get into this winding canyon, and you go to this little town. And so my grandfather's friends lived there. My grandfather had told them what he saw. They were just like, well, yeah, there's these little creatures or whatever. I guess they were kind of small, the ones that lived out there, because they said most of them were not real big. But they looked like coyotes, and they ran around on two legs. The Mexicans from Mexico in that area, that's what they claimed. They told me not to be, because I used to like to wander around this old Spanish mission that was from the 1700s. It was really, really crazy old place, and they believed that it was haunted. So nobody in that little area would go to that mission. But I'd go wander around in there, and I'd take a stick, and I'd go and look for stuff. I found all kinds of trinkets and stuff in there. These locals had just left it alone because they were afraid of it. They told me not to be playing around out there, because there were snakes and stuff. I remember going to sleep one night as a little kid and looking up, and there was a cemetery at the top of the hill. I remember thinking I saw people moving around in that cemetery, but the only way to get to that cemetery is by walking. There's no way to drive up there. They hadn't buried people there in a long, long time. They had to walk the dead up there to bury them in that cemetery. And I remember seeing these shadowy things moving around up there. So I told Manuel, this old guy that was my grandfather's friend that owned that store, I said, I saw something in the window up on the hill. And he told me, he goes, oh, no, it's nothing. It's no big deal. My grandfather asked him, because my grandfather didn't care what scared me or if it didn't scare me. He was pretty ridiculous. But he was just like, oh, it was probably one of them coyote men or whatever running around up there. And I'm a little kid going like, what? And I just put that out of my mind. It's like my dad's half-brothers in Joppa talking about, oh, yeah, there's these looky-loos out there. None of that ever mattered to me. I didn't even really believe any of it until I saw something myself. And then it intrigued me, like this stuff is real. But I just think back on that, and I remember thinking there's these things running around up there, and the locals there, they just seem to think, well, it's no big deal. It's just these coyote men. They like to play near the cemetery. Which is weird because that's where my friend Jacob, in a cemetery in town, on the edge of town in Marfa, which would have been about 40, 50 miles back the other way, that's where they saw those things, was running around in the cemetery. So, and the first story I told was about my friend Ash, our Ash. Ash claims that he saw this thing follow him home from a cemetery. Yeah, I don't know what their connection is to that or why that is, but it just seems to be a really recurring theme of these creatures, this cemetery inhabitant. There's got to be some kind of connection to that. And I read a lot of books about this stuff. But the ancient Irish believe, kind of contrary to the way the European mainland, the Germanic belief, and the French and whatever, the Iberians, they believed a little differently. That these things were shape-shifting werewolves. They were bloodlust. They were ravenous. They hung out in the woods. They killed people. And then they went back into town and lived normal lives. But in Ireland, they believed that these werewolves, they were werewolves 24/7. They were dog-headed men, and that they were a cross between a spirit and a corporeal flesh being, and that they were the guardians of the dead. Which is kind of strange that they would believe that, because that whole belief is that it kind of ties in to them hanging around in the cemetery, or why they would be hanging out in the cemetery area, you know what I mean? But some of the research I've done has led me to believe that these things have been around for a long, long time. And there's a precedent for them in all these different cultures. Like I told you, my friend who was Persian, his dad was from Iran. My friend was born over here. But his dad, I ate dinner with him one time, and his dad was telling me that he held the belief that these things were a jinn. If anybody doesn't know what a jinn is a Arabic, their version of like a demon. But they don't consider it a demon in the way that Christians believe in a demon. The way Christians believe in a demon is a fallen angel that has fallen to earth, that went against God, that rebelled. Well, their belief is that the leader of the jinn was known as Iblis. And that God created them, unlike the angels, he created them with the ability to have free will. And that they basically rebelled against God. They followed Iblis, because when God created Adam, he created man. He said, behold, my creation, it is equal to you. And Iblis said, no, it's not. I'm better than him. And God said, no, you're not. And told Iblis to bow before Adam. Almost as like he was punishing him, I guess, and that's how it says it in the Quran. That Iblis told him, no, I'm not going to do it. He was arrogant, and he went against God. You know, and of course, in the Bible, it says that Satan, he hardened his heart against God. So it parallels the Bible. Similar story, but they don't believe the same about the jinn as we do demons. We would call them demons. Their term for jinn is almost like an all-encompassing term. It's almost like some of the jinn are so dissimilar to one another that it's like the difference between, us and a giraffe. So it's kind of like, there's this catch-all term that they have. So his dad said he saw the back side of this thing, and he said that anything that looks like that has to be a jinn. I told him, I said, respectfully, I don't agree. I don't believe that they are jinn. I said these things have corporeal bodies. I don't believe that a jinn would change into something like that, but I said this thing looks as real as anything. I don't believe that I would have been deceived enough to not see that. You know what I mean? And he said, well, it could have been, a shaitan. And now the term shaitan is basically in the Bible when it's kind of a translation when people think that Jesus is actually talking to Satan, because what we think of as Satan is Lucifer, which would be the Arabic version of Iblis, which would be their head bad guy or whatever. Well, shaitan actually just translates to unclean spirit. It means a foul and unclean spirit. In Arabic is like the root derivative. It's like it's very similar to Aramaic, and Jesus would have been speaking Aramaic, which is like the root of Arabic. So he says, shaitan, get thee behind me, shaitan. He's basically commanding the spirit to get away from him, And, what I thought was strange, he says, well, it could have been a shaitan. A shaitan is basically, in the Arabic belief in the jinn, is that it is an evil version of a jinn. Because the jinn actually have free will, so they're not all condemned. There's only a small group of them that are blasphemers, and that the other ones, if they accept God and they accept Allah, then supposedly they can repent and they can, whatever. And that they believe that some of the jinn are actually Christians. They believe in Christ, and some of the jinn are actually Muslims. So you get a kind of a mishmash of these different spirits, and some of these spirits aren't even really that intelligent. I guess they're kind of like animal spirit type things, and some of them are more like people. Sometimes you'll hear about people like they'll be having a spiritual encounter or something, and they'll hear growling or something at the foot of their bed, or they'll have. It's never happened to me personally, but I've heard of people having these entities in their house. We talked about this, where they look like these dog-headed creatures, and they appear out of nowhere and appear in their bedroom or their house. That's a very strange phenomenon. I don't know what that could be. Now, something like that, I could get on board and say, okay, this could be a jinn, and it could be a shaitan. As far as like just lumping it all in one big group and saying, oh, it's a jinn, that's a jinn, this is a jinn. Some of my Arabic friends that do that, they drive me nuts, because I'm like, really? Everything is a jinn? Just everything is a jinn. You see something in a tree, that's a jinn. You see something in water, that's a jinn. I mean, it's just a catch-all term for a bunch of unexplainable stuff. Not to offend Muslim listeners, but it kind of is. It's kind of like, I've studied the Quran, and I do speak broken Arabic, not fluent, but I did work with Lebanese for a long time, and I do understand. I speak French, and I speak German. I do know a lot of these stories, and a lot of these really old books, to translate them, you have to be able to speak the language, because if you don't, an English translation is just not going to work. They didn't have planes, trains, and automobiles back in the day when Muhammad translated the Quran from what they believed the angel Gabriel, whatever. Back in Jesus' day, they didn't have those words for a lot of these things. So when they talk about smokeless flame, I believe that what they're talking, these entities, I believe, this is what I think, that these things are some sort of plasmic being, because you see these things as, what do you call those balls of light? Orbs. People see orbs. You know what I'm saying, Vic? I think that's what these people are seeing is these orbs. I think those are some sort of jinn-type entity. I believe that they exist in this sort of strange, not quite physical, not quite spiritual realm. And I think that sometimes when people have encounters with these things and they get some sort of plasmic jelly-like substance that accumulates in certain areas, like where there's like manifestations of demonic manifestations. I had a priest friend of mine tell me that he worked with an exorcist in Belize, and that there was a jelly-like substance on the wall of this woman's a house where they were doing an exorcism. He was a Dominican priest, and he was trying to exorcise ectoplasm. There you go, ectoplasm-type substance. I believe that that is because these entities are a plasmic-type being. I believe that that's how they shapeshift. And I believe that at some point, and this is my belief, that at some point science will catch up to the spiritual realm, and that we will be open. And I just thank God that there's this explosion of technology that we can throw around theories and beliefs. I guess not really theories, because theories have to be tested or proven, but ideas, theorems, or whatever of like what these things are. And I've read so many books about so many different beliefs, and you've got to read both sides. It's like I tell people, if you read about the Civil War, you can't just read about the South. You got to read about the North, because you don't get a good grasp on anything when you just read one side. So much of people in history, we're being taught just one side of everything. So you got to kind of read the skeptic's belief and let it sink in and think, okay, well, that's what they believe. But you got to read other people, and I know there's a lot of people in this country who are not open to anything Muslim or Arabic because of all the wars and things that were going on between our cultures. But you got to understand other people's views and beliefs. You don't have to read it and believe it, but you can take something, some kernel of truth away from all these different legends and myths and stories. One thing we had talked about in the pre-interview, I had told you that I had a theory, it was like the Cynocephali. Do you remember us talking about that, Vic?
I do.
Okay. The Cynocephali is an ancient race of dog-headed men. The Greeks are the ones that coined the phrase, the Cynocephali. These things were dog-headed people that had lived for thousands of years. These things had existed. Many people believe that they were like a warrior race, and that they had been used as mercenaries in various wars and things like that. There's stories that King Darius actually used them against Alexander, and that some of Alexander's people, because Alexander, I know a lot of people call him the scientist king, he was enthralled by culture and history and all these different stories. Well, I know a lot about the Persian aspect of it because I've read a lot of different stories about the Shahnameh and the different Persian stories. I talked to my friend Arash and his dad, and of course the Greek and Persian cultures kind of melded, together, because when Alexander the Great, and this is why history is so important, when he conquered that region, the Persians began to make up the bulk of his army, so that when he went into conquer in India, and he fought against Porus, the great Mogul or whatever, when he defeated these different realms, by the time that he had gotten as far as they were going to get, before his men eventually mutinied in India, he had gotten as far as he was going to go. His army that started out as 40,000 Macedonians was pretty much down to 12,000, and the bulk of his army became Persian. Well, the Hellenistic culture, the Greek culture, began to supplant Persian culture, and then vice versa. A lot of this trade, this serious trade and all this commerce began to open up because of Alexander's efforts. Because prior to that, Thermopylae, and, if anybody's seen the movie 300, all that's based upon stuff that happened prior to Alexander in 334 BC, when Alexander actually conquered Persia. And the Persians became Greeks, and the Greeks kind of became Persians, and all that area in between there, the Anatolia, which became Turkey, both cultures believed that these Cynocephali hailed from that region. The region of Anatolia was originally where they came from. And this is what the Greeks and the Persians believe. They follow me here. I'm not saying this is what I believe or whatever, because there's stories of these things in all regions. I just read a book about Patagonia in South America, where Magellan and some of his fellow exploring conquistadors saw these dog-headed men with these giant feet. They had a name for them too, and I don't remember exactly, but it was just like they didn't know what they were. They just said they looked like Dogman, and they called them something. But the Greeks and the Persians encountered these Cynocephali in that area of Anatolia. The dog-headed men were a semi-wild species of like feral men. They considered them to be more men than dogs because they had a communication. They would communicate by barking and yelps, and they actually, some of them dressed in like clothing. At least they wore like jackets and stuff, and they tended to, from the stories that I've read and the different things I've deciphered, like the different languages, I've had to cross language barriers to read some of this stuff. They actually dressed in clothing to mimic modern man, and I think it was more to make us feel more comfortable around them, because in their appearance it was terrifying, and these people were always afraid of them. And there were instances of when the Babylonians were being supplanted by the Persians that they used them against the Babylonians, and the Babylonians, some of them gave up without a fight because they're being attacked by these dog-headed men. You know, they're like, what is this? The earliest story that I ever found about these dog-headed creatures, it goes back to ancient Sumeria, Sumar, the capital. There was this city that was not far from there. It was called I can't remember the exact name of it. I had it written down yesterday, but anyways, this city that was it was one of those city-states that paid tribute to Sumar. They had not received tribute, and there had not been any merchants, anything had come by for a while. So the king of Sumar sent an emissary and a group of soldiers to go find out what was going on. Well, they get to this tribute city, and there's nothing there. It's been decimated. Everybody's been butchered and killed. Well, they found in the hills there, they found some stragglers that had been hiding, and they claimed that these dog-headed men had come in the night and just killed everyone and made off with all the livestock. One of the things I find intriguing is that over and over again, I read about these things. I find that these things some of them are shepherds, that they tend to take animals and domesticate them, which would give you the impression that these things are highly intelligent. In a human sense, maybe not that intelligent, but in an animal sense, yeah, they're going to be at the height of intelligence in an animal sense. I mean, I know that the Eastern Orthodox Church, it founded a lot of its beliefs, the Byzantine Empire, which was the Eastern Roman Empire, which came from that Anatolic region until they were conquered and supplanted by the Turks. The Eastern Orthodox Church was the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire. Now, one of their biggest patron saints that they paid homage to was St. Christopher. But St. Christopher, in a lot of the Eastern Orthodox belief, was that he was one of these dog-headed men. And now, you can look this up. I'm not making this up. This is what I've read. St. Christopher had repented. He was one of these creatures, and that he was given the ability to communicate and speak because of his love for God, and that he became a Christian, and that God granted him a man's appearance, that he eventually was given the appearance of a human. And it says that, I don't know how to describe this, the name of this town. There was this city, though, that they called the City of the Dogman, and it was in the far eastern reaches of Anatolia. The Byzantines knew about it. They had a term for it. And I know that there was an emperor, I believe, I guess it was Valerius or Diocletian, one of them, I can't remember the exact name, but I know that that emperor had issued a decree that anyone that would bring these things to him, because he wanted proof, he would pay them. It's hard to make heads or tails of what these things really were, but these things, they pop up throughout history in all these different cultures, and everyone has a different theory about it, you know, and you're probably just as in the dark as I am about it, but I tell you, the cynocephali is probably the closest we would come to having any kind of idea of what these things are, if they are just a physical manifestation of something with a corporeal body. I would like to know, because even though I've never had another encounter with one, I know a lot of people who have, and I wouldn't say a lot, when you consider the population is huge, but I've kept my eyes and ears open, and I've heard lots of stories about it, you know, so I know that these things exist, and they live in this region where I'm at. I know that there's Bigfoot in the area near Bastrop. I don't hear much about Dogman in that heavily wooded area, but I hear a lot about Bigfoot. And I just believe that if the Bigfoot's out there and it exists, then these things got to exist. And I know that there is a historical precedence for these things.
It's ironic that you mentioned all these instances of dog-headed men being mentioned throughout history, Josh. I don't know the particulars, but supposedly there was an African village comprised of dog-headed men who were supposedly herdsmen. Moving on, you forgot to mention Jason's encounter. That's a good story.
Yeah, actually, he was a roommate of ours for a while. I just want to say one more thing about the cynocephaly. What you were talking about in Africa, it would actually be in North Africa. Is that what you're talking about? Because that's where I know that there's a legend I read about in Libya, or in that North African area, and that dates back to Herodotus. I believe it was him. He tells a story of, and that would actually be Carthage, the remnants of Carthage, and that these things would hang around the ruins of what was once Carthage. If the Romans ever crossed through that area, they would see these things from the shore. And of course, the Romans and the Persians had one thing in common. They both believed the sea was evil, the salt water was evil. Where they traveled, they would run into these demonic-type entities. Really, a lot of it was probably just a superstition that they didn't know what these things were. They would see something that might have looked like a Dogman or a Bigfoot or even a giant cat that they had never seen before. It was some sort of demonic thing, you know. And I believe that that's part of why so many of the people believe that, oh, well, you see something anomalous like that. If you're a Christian, oh, it's a demon. If you're a Muslim, oh, it's a jinn. Well, that sounds nice. You can put it into a little box, a little term like that, but that doesn't explain these things running around with corporeal bodies and doing trade with the Persians and inhabiting the region between Greece and Persia, and everyone from Alexander the Great's army all the way up to the modern times having seen these things, and that they believe that they exist and that they have actually done trade. The people in that region, some of them said that they were Black Sea pirates, that they knew how to sail, and that sometimes these pirates would have dogmen on their boats, on their crew with them. I read lots of stories about these things. They may not be as concentrated now. They don't have areas where they have cities, so to speak, but they're still around. They may just be completely wild now, you know, just they're not as organized and civilized as they once were. But I do believe in these stories. I believe that there's just too many historical stories about these things that has to be a precedent for them, you know. And like the word cynocephaly, the prefix cyno means dog. If you take the word dog and cephalic with head, it becomes that word. And that's a Greek word. The Greeks coined that term. Why would the Greeks make a word like that unless they knew of these things and they saw them? Let me get to Jason's encounter here. When I lived in my old apartment, we had this picture on the wall. It was a Franzetta picture, Frank Franzetta. It was a picture of a werewolf-looking thing, a really huge thing coming out of the woods. I don't know where that picture ended up, but eventually I had to take it down because it was about to attack this vampiric, generic-looking Dracula character. And in the distance, there was like a castle, and it was really cool. I had an ex-girlfriend. She gave it to me. It was framed and everything, and I hung it in the spare bedroom. Well, I had some paranormal things that was happening in my house. And for some reason, this thing was always being flung to the ground or thrown across the room. It didn't really happen while I was in the house. Only one time did I ever hear it fall. We found it in various places around the room, under the bed, behind the desk. It was ridiculous. We hung it all over the place. For whatever reason, this ghost or entity, I don't know what it was, what you want to call it, it didn't like this picture. And it was tossing it everywhere. And so it was just like, fine. So we eventually took it down because the frame on it broke. So we ended up like taking it down. I just rolled it up, and I don't even know whatever happened to it. But anyways, back when I was working at the club, there was this guy who was from California, and he had rode his bike all the way here from San Bernardino to live in Austin because he had a friend that she worked downtown, and he wanted a job. So he came to the club one night. I gave him a job. He didn't have a place to stay. So I basically had a lot of different friends and bartenders and bouncers that would crash at our place until they found somewhere to go. I did that a lot, you know. I tried to be nice and help people out because downtown you meet so many different people. So this guy stayed with us for a couple weeks, and he was in that guest bedroom at one point, and he was looking at that picture, and he's like, that picture creeps me out. And I said, yeah, a lot of people say that. And I told him, I said, why does it creep you out? He says, you know, I had an encounter with something when I was in Arizona at a rest stop. And I was like, well, tell me about it. And he's like, well, if I told you, you'd probably just make fun of me. So I told him about my encounter, and then he told me about his encounter because I wanted to make him feel better. I said, look, I'll tell you mine, because sometimes I would tell mine after somebody would tell me about their story. You know, I'd try to get them to talk or whatever, and then when I would tell them my story, they acted like I was making it up, like, you know, in reaction to theirs. And I'm like, no, look, this is for real. So I told him what happened to me. And he said, well, mine was different. I didn't actually see this thing. I never actually laid eyes on it. He's like, but I was tired, and I'd been sleeping in rest stops on the picnic benches. And he said, one night, I decided to just go back behind the picnic bench when I was in the desert. And he's like, but there was still a little bit of trees there. So he went and he curled up and went to sleep right there near the tree line. And I told him, I said, you weren't worried about snakes or scorpions? He's like, dude, I was so tired. I didn't give a damn what bit me. So he just crashed out. The reason he had a motorcycle is because him and his ex-wife had divorced. He said she got the kids, the house, and the SUV. So he ended up with nothing but a bike. So he just said, screw it, and came to Austin. So anyway, he curled up, went to sleep. He said about 3 a.m., he was just woken up with a start. He didn't know why. He just instantly woke up. And he said he'd only gone to sleep about 11 o'clock, he said it was. He's like, I could have slept for days as tired as I was, but I woke up just wide awake. And then he's like, I don't know what it was that woke me up. He's like, but then a couple minutes after laying there awake, trying to go back to sleep, I heard this howling. And he said it was this horrible, like just scary sounding howling. And he said that it was off in the distance, but it seemed like it was getting closer and closer. He said that he was frozen with fear. He's like, I was just scared. He goes, and then he goes, it was weird because in the desert, you know, at night it gets cold. He said, but it was really cold, like unseasonably cold. There's no way it should have been that cold. And he said that I just could see my breath, and he goes, I thought, man, what is going on here? He goes, I really just began to be totally paralyzed with fear. That howling, the cold air, just everything. You know, it was a cold night, and he goes, I was just terrified. He's like, but I couldn't bring myself to sit up and go to my bike and leave. He's like, I was stuck. And he said that he began to hear this footfall behind him. At that point, he's like, I got to get up. I got to get up. He said he finally made his legs work, and he got up. He walked quickly to his bike. He didn't want to run because he was afraid that whatever it was might chase him, you know. But he took off walking quickly to his bike. He said he got up to his bike, and he heard this thing coming behind him. He said he knew. He could hear breathing. He could hear like a growling type grumbling. He said he heard the footfall, and he thought, oh, my God, this thing is like right behind me. This thing is probably just about to pounce on me. And he said that he was leaned over his bike thinking, okay, what do I do? Do I turn around and hit it with my helmet? What the hell do I do? He didn't know what to do, and so he said that he was starting to put his helmet on. He was going to turn around and face it. And he said just then, this car on this desolate highway, he said this truck pulls in from the highway into the rest stop. They pulled in, and then it came to a stop, like with a, you know, all of a sudden, boom, you know, and he said that he thought they were going to hit him. And he said at that point, he turned around, and he didn't see anything. He said the girl rolled her window down, and she was like, what the was that? Well, excuse my language. And the guy was like, did you see that? Like, what was that? Like, they both saw it, I guess, because they had their lights on it. And the guy turned around and goes, I didn't see it, but I heard it, and I thought it was just about to jump on me. And the girl said, yeah, it was about 10 feet behind you. When my light hit it, it just turned and took one big leap, and it was behind the tree line already. He was just sitting there like, oh, my God. He goes, I thought I was toast. You know, he thought this thing was going to kill me. He said that he was never been so terrified in his life, but he didn't see it. He actually turned around, and it was gone. So he's like, I didn't see it. And I asked them to describe it, and they said that it looked like a werewolf. So that is his story, you know. And then he said that they were nice enough to follow him back into town, which was about 15 miles into town. And they stopped at some diner and had breakfast together. And he said that they were really nice people, and they told him just be careful. They just kept talking about it. What was that? They said that there was a waitress that was waiting on them, and that she heard them talking. She's like, you know what? I know somebody who might be able to clarify it. I'm not for sure, you know, but she went and she got this cook, and he came out, you know, and apparently he was in the Apache, Mescalera, or whatever that region. I believe that's what he said it was, but I don't know. He said that this Native American told him, yeah, that's a skinwalker. We call that road Skinwalker Road, that highway right there, because people see these things periodically. And he said that thing that was out there near that rest stop, he said that there had been a couple incidents where people had been attacked by something, and one guy actually had disappeared going down this road, and the last place he was seen was at that rest stop. I can't verify this, and neither can my friend that I was telling me this. He just said this is what this guy told him. And he said that was a skinwalker, and it was up to no good, dude. He goes, you're lucky to be alive right now, because that thing would have definitely done something to you.
You talk about some information that you could have used well before you decided to stop at that campsite.
And it's not a campsite, it's just a rest stop. But that's the thing about these deals. You don't know where they're going to pop up or where they're going to appear. There's just so many stories about these things. One of the things I was going to ask is if, really quickly, can I say something about my aunt, what she claimed about these black dogs?
Sure.
I remember we had talked about that. Those black dogs that we had seen, like my friend claimed he saw those three that jumped out in the road. I had talked to my great aunt before she had died, and she claimed that there was a story about these things, and that they were seen in and around Hidalgo Park for a long time. And that the reason was because there was a musician, he was a mariachi from Mexico, and that he had come from Mexico, and that he had fallen in love with this local Mexican girl, and that she married a really wealthy guy. He was in love with her, and he was poor. He didn't have any way to impress her or do anything. All he had was his horn. He could play music. And so he went to a bruja, like a curandera. She gave him this contract. Now, this is just a legend. This is a myth. That's what I was told by my great aunt, just to explain this. But supposedly he signed a pact with the devil, and that it gave him the ability to play music very beautifully, and that through that, he was able to put together a band, and they wanted to play better. So he talked them into doing the same thing. So they put this band together, and they played the most beautiful music, and they were able to captivate this beautiful girl that he wanted to be with. Eventually, she did start to cheat on her husband with him, and she fell in love with him. But it was all just a facade, because anytime you do a deal with the devil, it all comes crashing down. And eventually, he was found out. The guy that was really rich, he owned some land there around town. He found out that his wife was cheating with this low-life mariachi. So he and his friends went after him, and they beat him really bad, and they castrated him, supposedly. And after that, of course, he couldn't make love with her anymore, and so she lost interest and left him or whatever. And eventually, he committed suicide. He killed himself. And then shortly thereafter, his bandmates all died in a car wreck right outside of town, a little town called Circleville, right outside of my hometown. It's not even really a town, it's just like a store and a whatever. And supposedly that's where they all died. And that their spirits came back as these black dogs. And that supposedly in the place where this guy died, there was a black dog that would appear there, And that supposedly some of the people that witnessed the wreck of where these men had died, that they saw these black dogs come leaping out of that wreckage. And that they were the souls of those men, that they're cursed to be these dog men, and that they wander around in that area, causing problems or whatever. And they're forced to be in that form until Judgment Day. That's the story that she told me, and I don't know, it's just something that was passed down to her. Like I said, there's a kernel of truth in all myth. Who knows? I appreciate you letting me talk and ramble on, and glad I had another chance to come back and tell you these stories that I had collected over the years.
I was just glad to have you come back and share all these stories with us. Thanks again. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you, Vic. I felt a lot more at ease this time around because I wasn't having to recount my encounter. You know what I mean? It was like the last time I felt kind of an anxiety, and I was just kind of like I just wanted to get through the things that had happened to me, but it was a lot easier this time just because, even though I had to start off with that bear hunt, that was kind of anxiety, but these other stories that happen to other people, it's like I empathize with it, but I'm just glad it wasn't me. That's the one thing I always think, and I'm not trying to be selfish, but God darn, you would be the same way. You're glad that it's better you than me, buddy. This thing's happened to these people. Like being in that church or being out in the middle, of a pasture with a gun and you got these three things. Those kind of stories, it's like they scare the hell out of me. I've thought about these things long and hard, and I'm like, man, I just hope that I'm never putting myself in that position where the worst part about it would be you get torn apart or something happens and nobody even knows. They don't know what happened. The first thing in people's minds is not going to be, oh, he got eaten by a dog man. Oh, poor so-and-so. That sucked. They're not going to know. Nobody's going to have a clue where you are or what happened to you. Nothing.
Yeah, that is a really good point. We'll never know how many people who disappeared wound up falling at the hands of a dog man. We'll never know that.
And I've read those missing 411. That's some weird stuff, man. I'm telling you, and I always think about that, and I think, wow, I know 100,000% to anybody who's listening, let me tell you, I don't care how much experience in the woods you got or what you think you know or what kind of special forces or your ghetto credentials. I don't care about all your toughness or whatever. You go up against one of these things, you're really stupid. I wouldn't recommend being like my cousin's friend and going, I'm going to go check it out. That's a Scooby-Doo moment right there. And that's where something bad should have happened to him. He's lucky because the only thing standing between him and the Almighty was hundreds of pounds of beef. He could have been easily killed. The thing is, you don't know when or where these things could appear. The only thing you can do is just be cognizant of it. At least believe the stories because there's enough people that this thing's happened to. I'm surprised that more people haven't just been outright killed where somebody has witnessed it, and I think it's just because a lot of this stuff happens in remote, isolated places. And I also believe that when somebody is killed, they don't attribute it to these things because the common conception is that they don't exist.
You've got some really well thought out ideas there, Josh, with I think a lot of basis and fact. Remember, you're always welcome to come back if you ever have any more stories to share.
Thank you for the time, man, and I'm glad that I could share. If you ever want to do another one about some of the stuff that I've been able to research, we can talk about that, just to show about the research that I've done. I don't think I'm a good writer, and I'm not a good typer. My hands are all mangled. I've broken all my fingers from boxing and fighting and stuff, and so I get arthritic when I try to type, and I can't. But that's what kind of kept me from ever trying to write anything. But yeah, I do appreciate the forum because I have a lot of information that I've collected over the years, all stemming from my encounter in 1990. Just because that was the only encounter I ever had, and I'm thankful for that actually, doesn't mean that it didn't start a fire in me that's pushed me to learn more about these things, because, and I believe that everything ties in, history, science, it's all relative. It all ties in together, and I believe that you can find a lot of things out just by learning about history.
I think it's just the butterfly effect, but like I said, thanks again so much for coming back on, Josh, and have a great night.
You too, Vic.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye. If you've had a Dogman encounter and you'd like to speak with me about it, whether in private or on the show, you can reach me at contact@dogmanencounters.com. I'd love to hear from you.